Today I'm joined by my friend Joshua Mitchell, who is a professor of political theory at Georgetown University. Welcome, Josh.
Good to be here, Johnny.
Yeah, it's great to have you for a conversation I'm really excited about, especially given our work in the humanities on college campuses today at ISI. And really what I want to dive into is what is the role of the humanities in shaping the character of the citizens in the American Republic? What role has it played historically, going back to the time of the Founding Fathers, and how has that changed over the centuries?
Well, Americans are a practical people, first of all, and they're not as literate as the Europeans are. But nevertheless, America has a long and wonderful tradition of literature. Our understanding is that, especially since the beginning of the 20th century, is that we have to have a culture that understands, or at least a certain number of people have to understand, the importance of the great books. Not by accident did America come up with the great books tradition. It came up with it really...
Wait, America came up with the great books tradition?
Yes, because...
What does that mean?
Well, so in the 1920s, 1930s, in the aftermath of World War I, you have people at the University of Chicago and at Columbia deciding that we need to have a great books tradition. And I have in my office a 47-volume great books collection, and these were produced 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and so many people in the United States had them in their own homes. And the question is, why did this emerge? And I think when America entered into World War I, we had to ask the question, what is it that we're fighting for? We're not quite European, but we are of European descent. What are we fighting for? Rousseau has a very famous line in the first discourse, without war, there would be no history. Wars drive you to think about the long trajectory of your culture, what it means, how it's developed. And so the great books tradition emerges in America, really in the early part of the 20th century. It goes, I mean, it's still alive today to some extent in 1985 when Jesse Jackson goes to Stanford and says, we're done with the tradition of dead white men. It begins to decompose. My view is that we have to have this tradition to understand our civilization. One of my great frustrations is that I listen to the radio, I turn on the news, I look at X, and I see fragments of ideas, fragments of Rousseau, fragments of Tocqueville, fragments of the founders, fragments of Marx. And there's no possible way that we can develop a literate culture and have coherent political discussions without a deeper understanding of these ideas. We can't move forward with fragments of ideas. We have to move forward with whole ideas. And that great books tradition allows citizens to become literate and to discuss whole ideas.
So I'm curious, how does the canon that came out of the University of Chicago, or that was developed in the 20th century, compare to what John Adams, for example, would have learned when he went off to Harvard, over a century before that?
Many of the books probably would have been the same. I'm actually not familiar with that canon, but straight through, straight through the European universities, we have a long tradition of books pertaining to the humanities. I think one of the big differences here is that if you're living in the aristocratic age, and so I'll put Adams in the aristocratic age, and we'll go all the way back to the Roman times, there was an understanding that history can't be fully understood, and as a consequence, the task of education is to provide exemplars. So George Washington, a modest man, concludes he wants to become a virtuous man. What does he do? He reads Plutarch's Lives, where you get examples of greatness. So the humanities tradition, I think, through much of history, has been with a view to providing exemplars to aristocrats who want to become great. As you move into the democratic age, as you know, this is Tocqueville speaking, as you move into the democratic age, the idea of individual greatness dissipates. And so that tradition begins to fall apart. But I think after World War I in the United States, we reinvent the tradition, not with a view to exemplars, but with a view to the coherent ideas that give shape to the American regime in the West. So it's the canon of Western ideas, not the canon of books that will show you how to become great. Slightly different. Yeah.
See, I like the canon of books that show you how to become great.
Yes.
Obviously, these are
we
these can
this.
be complementary to each other.
Yes, we need this.
So is would you say, is it fair to say that the scope of the project, did it change from sort of something that was exclusively for elites to something that was broadened to the general populace, or is it more so a change in the understanding of the canon? And it's still, I guess, to what is the interplay between humanities being a project for the few versus humanities being able to benefit the many in the context of our republic?
So I think that's one of the things that makes America special. The Northwest Territories Act of 1787, I believe, has in it a clause, in order to keep the great deceiver at bay, Satan at bay, we must have public education. So America becomes much more literate for theological reasons. It's a Protestant culture. We have to keep Satan away. The way to do this is you have to have universal literacy. So I think there's a push toward universal literacy, though not elite literacy in America, which is very, very important. And so when the great books tradition comes out, because we're more concerned with the common man and common literacy, again, we shift away from the idea that these books are to be exemplars of greatness, because as you know, as you move to the democratic age, the idea of greatness begins to dissipate. It's something we have to resurrect, to be sure. But I think that's part of the reason why the American canon, the great books canon in America, isn't as focused on the thing that you were talking about a minute ago, namely the idea of individual greatness and exemplars. So it's universal education, I think, that gives the fertile ground to develop a canon that is supposed to be for everyone. As I mentioned, you can find these at any kind of used bookstore. You can buy them for 40 or 50 bucks, 50 volumes of the great works of Western civilization. And so many Americans have these in their homes, not with a view to achieving greatness, but with a view to understanding that there is this culture that we're participating in. America, with respect to Europe, has always been the strange relationship. You know this. On the one hand, we are descendant, most Americans are descendant from Europe, and yet, as Tocqueville points out, there's a kind of new beginning. So America always has this ambivalent relationship to the European canon. But I think after World War I, and especially after World War II, there was this understanding that no, we're part of a larger civilizational process. We need to defend that civilization, and understanding the canon helps us do that.
Absolutely fascinating. So there was a piece recently in The Atlantic, which I'll summarize briefly. Basically, the premise of it was, sort of meet the elite college students who can't read. And it was talking with professors at Ivy League universities, top universities, about kind of a dual problem. In one sense, the professors themselves have reduced their curriculum, the number of books. In one example, it was from 7 books down to 1 book.
Yeah.
They've gone from reading whole books to reading excerpts of books. Some of this they trace back to Common Core and sort of the way teaching for the test has kind of changed, what would get assigned at younger levels. Another aspect of this is probably the rise of the smartphone and just reduced attention spans. Yeah. Then maybe some of this is also kind of the sense of careerism that's pervaded higher education. And so, why read if I'm just preparing for a professional career in consulting or tech, and I don't need this canon. I'm curious, you've taught both in the United States and also in the Middle East students, great books, Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Mm-hmm. I'm curious what you make of that idea. Why aren't students, especially at the best schools, reading the way they should? And what do you encounter when students are reading through these texts?
I want to answer that question, but I also want to put it in the framework of a larger development in the 20th and 21st century. I divide American history into 3 distinct phases. The phase of the founding, which was based on citizen competence. The phase of progressivism, which is based on expert competence. And I think in that phase, let's say the early part of the 20th century, I would say to maybe the beginning of the 21st century, where your task as an elite is to develop competence, including fluency in great books. And there were a lot of people who did develop that fluency. So what's happened in the beginning of the 21st century is we've moved to a third phase where the purpose of elite education is not to raise competent experts to fill the progressive bureaucratic class. But in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a shift. The task now is to convey to students who are the innocent victims and who are not. Because we're living in this third moment of American history, which I hope is short, in which the sole task of government seems to be to dispense aid on the basis of innocent victimhood. And so we're producing an elite class whose sole concern is, are you an innocent victim or not? And if you are a transgressor, you simply have to admit your white privilege, and then you get advanced. Now, that has massive implications for teaching the canon, because instead of what could be called hermeneutics of deference, where you defer to the text, you understand there's wisdom in here. The task, once you step into this third phase of history, is not to be deferential to the text, sit at its feet and learn and listen to it. It is to establish through the hermeneutics of critique why the text author is guilty of this transgression or that transgression. I mentioned Jesse Jackson in 1985, who basically begins the No More Dead White Men study movement. And so now I find that students, the worst of them, not all of them, but the worst of them will say things like, well, why should I study Plato? He was an aristocrat, a white guy. Why should I do this? So the hermeneutic of critique has gotten to the point where students don't even feel the need to engage in these texts. We assign them, they read them, but in the back of their head, they think, well, this is just a dead white guy. He has this sort of privilege. I shouldn't take it seriously. So that is a major overarching theme. And then you mentioned the fact that attention spans have diminished. So you just look at media, for example. In the 60s, 30 minutes was the unit. With the MTV generation, it was the 3.5-minute video. Now it's 8 to 15 seconds because it's TikTok and Instagram. So attention spans have completely collapsed. I continue to teach the same 7 books in my survey class, but there'll be times when I'm, say, lecturing on St. Augustine, and I remember back 30 years ago, and I think, well, I would have done this 30 years ago, but now it's absolutely hopeless. It's absolutely hopeless. They don't have the background knowledge. They don't have the suppleness of mind that they used to have by the time they came to us first-year freshmen. Now I see college increasingly as what high school was 30 years ago. Yeah, it's very bad.
It's dark. I want to talk about what we could do about that. Before I want to get back to kind of the kind of this ideological identity politics reading of the canon. In the wake of the death of George Floyd and kind of the swelling of protests that happened 4 years ago, you were involved with something called 1776 Unites, and worked with Bob Woodson on this project, which involved many Black scholars who were very proud both of their own kind of American history, but also the Western canon generally. What lessons did you learn from that in terms of how we might approach this identity politics narrative?
I was very fortunate. For about 18 months, Bob Woodson had a bi-weekly Zoom meeting of, in my view, the leading Black scholars in America: Glenn Loury, Delano Squires, Charles Love, occasionally Shelby Steele, John Sibley Butler. It was this amazing group, and I was privileged to be on it. And I learned many things about the self-understanding of conservative Blacks in the United States. What they were most troubled by, I think, and we did write a book called Red, White, and Black as a consequence of this. What they were most troubled by from the 1619 narrative was the claim of systemic racism. Now, there was no claim on their part that there wasn't racism. That was not what they were troubled by. What they were troubled by was the moral implications of the claim of systemic racism. If you make a claim that something is systemic, you're in effect saying that there's nothing you can do about it. The problem is so large that either you must end in fatalism, or there's only one unit that can help you to some extent, and there with nonstop funding, and that is the national government. And I think these Black conservatives have understood for a very, very long time that government can be a supplement to the mediating institutions, but not a substitute for them. So Martin Luther King, these guys would constantly point out, did want the government to help, to be sure, but he understood very clearly that Black America survived because of its strong mediating institutions. There have been studies that suggest that Black America is to use Theta Skocpol's words, is a nation of joiners more so than almost any other group, because the state has not always been its best friend. And so Black Americans figured out a long time ago that you needed to have these mediating institutions. And what especially the older generation of Black scholars is very concerned about is that when you have a language of systemic racism, what in effect you're telling to the young people is the churches can't help you, your families can't help you, your local friendship groups can't help you. There's nothing you can do except sit and feel despondent over your own prospects. Bob would say things like, he said that, in the 1960s and before, Black America had huge disagreements about how to proceed, but every single group believed in its agency. And he said the huge change that has occurred is that, and the 1619 Project is emblematic of it, is that Black America, much of it now believes the fable that there's systemic racism, that they're incapable of doing anything. And this is the thing that conservative Black scholars are most concerned about, is that the belief in agency in Black America is a serious problem. That's why Woodson has set up something called the Center for the Study of Resilience. What we all notice around Americans, it's Black America, it's white America, it's at all levels, is a sense of fatalism. And we have to address this. And I think one of the ways that we can do this is, instead of conveying the narrative of fatalism, and by the way, the green narrative, the climate change narrative is another narrative of fatalism. We have to bypass these narratives of fatalism. And the only way to do this with respect to, say, race is to have stories. We have to recover the stories of tremendous resilience, and not just among Black Americans, but among all Americans. The younger generation and the wealthy and the poor is very despondent. You look at suicide rates, you look at depression rates, you look at medication rates. We have got a generation now that's being raised that believes they have no hope whatsoever. And so what we must do when we think about books that we're going to teach, when we think about stories we're going to tell, we have to change the story. We have to, of course, we're not going to pretend America's perfect. No nation is perfect. I'm delighted I live in this imperfect nation. But what we have to do is to remind young people that there is hope. The younger generation has lost hope. And so we have to tell stories of hope going forward.
So on that note of stories of hope, you mentioned to me before that you can't have a civilization without a canon of books. We obviously know what's in the Western canon: Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Augustine, Shakespeare, etc.
Yeah.
What would you say are the books that inspire that hope in our own American context?
Well, I'm a Tocqueville scholar, I must say. And so my view is that Tocqueville is the most morally responsible writer, certainly of the last 200 years, because he knows, he sees very clearly this fatalism creeping into America. And I think his moral strength is that he insists that while we might be tempted in this direction, in point of fact, America is this remarkable place. He says, I praise democracy not for what it does, but for what it causes to be done. It's an extraordinary passage. And what he's saying is, democracy's a mess. You got a nation of space cowboys who are all over the place. And occasionally they can pull together and build something, and a lot of times they're at each other's throat. I praise democracy not for what it does, which is to create a mess, but for what it causes to be done. What does it do? It brings people out of themselves. It gets them engaged. And he says in one place, democracy unleashes an energy never before seen in human civilization. So if you can just give people a little hope, there's no limit to what the Americans can do. And so I think this message that Tocqueville gives, which both recognizes the temptation toward fatalism and reminds us that no, that cannot be the final word, that's the message we have to announce. It can't be that we're naive in believing these kind of airy fairy tales about never-ending possibility in America. We have to recognize that this is really hard to be democratic citizens in this very strange and wonderful country, but we have to remind people that we don't really know the limits of what we can accomplish if we can just pull together and work together.
And what do you think in terms of a national project or a national effort, as you think about in particular, like your students, what would it take to motivate them, to incentivize them, to inspire them to read the canon beyond just an excerpt here or there or one book? Is there anything that could drive them sort of at a national scale to embrace this great tradition?
So the question I always ask of my students who are disposed to think that we don't need a canon. I asked them, how's that working for you? Because what students will tell you when they're honest is that they're very disoriented. They're lost. They want to believe in something. They are involved in performative justice, which is a kind of ecstatic outburst, and then they fall back into servitude. I'm teaching a course called Conservatives and Radicals right now in Georgetown, and it's remarkable because my students will tell me that they feel like they have no hope. And I remind them that the great wager here is that these books, and Tocqueville in particular, but all of them, they can speak to human experience. And I think the job of teachers is to do that. One of the problems with the canon, and you mentioned this in our earlier conversation, is that those who are teaching it have stepped away from teaching the whole of it, the whole of the book, and instead teach snippets. Plato believes this, Marx believes this, Tocqueville believes this. No, we have to read whole books. We have to give students a chance to be fully immersed in a set of ideas. The book is the shortest unit, the smallest unit of comprehensive ideas. And what we've done is we moved from comprehensive ideas to fragments of ideas. And Twitter and the rest confirm all this, and we can't build a world on fragments of ideas. And so we have to pause, and we have to give ourselves time to delve into a book deeply. My view is that canon has to be rethought, not in terms of the books, but how we teach it. So I will occasionally, and whenever I can, teach a 15-week course on one book, Tocqueville's Democracy in America. I get through 2/3 of it if I'm lucky. But I want them to see that there are deep books here, and that instead of skating along in life saying, I disagree with that, I disagree with that, that's the product of privilege, etc., they have to see that these books have been here for a reason. We keep coming back to these generation after generation after generation. And Tocqueville's book, especially Democracy in America, I think should be on every shelf in every home in America, because it speaks to experience. And Tocqueville's book has been called an extended rumination, an extended philosophical rumination on the problem of loneliness. When I tell that to my students, there's a hook that they can then hang on to, and they can say, oh, so this is speaking to me. And so the teachers of the canon have to understand that we can't teach this in a way that doesn't speak to human experience. We are living out what Tocqueville described. Even Rousseau, there's a certain craziness with Rousseau. Even Nietzsche, there's a certain craziness there, but they're trying to get at the immediacy of human experience. The problem is the canon, in a way, has been betrayed. Let me explain. When you look at, say, the beginning of the history of political thought in the aftermath of World War II, because the field only begins after World War II, what were Leo Strauss and Hannah Arendt and the others trying to do? They were survivors, or they were near fatalities of the Holocaust, and what they understood that our task was to do was to connect the crisis of our times with the great books. And what's happened instead is political theory and academics in general has gotten lost in secondary and tertiary literature. It's forgotten that we have to attend to the immediate circumstances of our civilization and link them to the ideas of our civilization. There has to be this method of correlation, and instead academic political theory has gotten completely lost in the literature and lost sight of the fact that their first and primary task is not to reproduce themselves in the form of ongoing political theorists, but to help young Americans become citizens. And to do that, the only way this can happen is if you connect the books to their lived experience, and we can build a civilization that way. We can't do it on the fragments of ideas that are lurking around everywhere in the dust right now.
This reminds me of, I was just thinking back to when I first met you, and it was actually 11 years ago on the Eastern Shore of Maryland when you went out to the Trinity Forum to give a lecture. And I remember one of the things that you told us was, you know, there are so many, obviously at ISI, we have a lot of friends that publish books. You have a new recent book here, but one of the things you told us is that it would be better to pick 5 or 6 great books and to spend the rest of your life reading them over and over and over again than to keep up with all the new stuff that comes out.
Yeah, we can't keep up with all the new stuff that comes out. I tell my students at Georgetown who are paying $70,000 to $80,000 a year, and so many other places are charging that as well. I say to them that if after 4 years you cannot say, these are the 12 books I have learned in college, and I will carry with me in hardcover, not paperback, in hardcover, because you're going to be marking them for the next 30 years, then you have spent some $280,000, and it's been a complete waste. We have this measure of success, in my view, is that student comes out of colleges with books that they love and will pass on to their children. We need to be able to build a civilization that has fluency, and I do believe that means, to come back to your point about Common Core, we have to have a range of books that we can all have some measure of fluency in. And I think universities have a modest responsibility to do that. Are we going to teach students to learn Latin, Greek, and Hebrew? No, that's not what we're supposed to do in a democracy. What we're supposed to do in a democracy is recognize that we have to build a world together, and so we have to teach some level of civics, and I think something like Tocqueville and Democracy in America does that. But we also need to have students who have some broad fluency, short of reading Latin and Greek, and we have to be able to make tough calls and say, no, these are the books that are important. And universities should encourage this. And I think, frankly, while I'm nervous about the role of government, I think we need to be clear about the relationship between what governments do and what their effect on mediating institutions is. My view is that, in general, the conservative movement has to think in the following way. Mediating institutions matter. Local educational institutions matter. The government is a supplement, not a substitute for whatever you find below its own level. And so, just as we need to have a major scientific leap ahead, possibly by DARPA, probably by DARPA, that can do research into physics, chemistry, materials science, et cetera, and then it can spill over. You don't want to have the government deciding exactly what's supposed to happen, but the government needs to seed projects so that they're supplements to the economic sphere. And with respect to the humanities, I think that's the case too. You don't want the government coming in and saying, everybody in America must read these books. But with something like NEH, you could have gentle encouragements. You could have a committee of people who understand that the great challenge we have in the 21st century is we have a generation of kids who are fatalistic and have no hope. And so we have to survey the range of American literature, find those stories of hope and joy, and convey them, not as required, but as a recommendation. And the government, I think, has a role in that in the same way it has with respect to industrial development. Encouragements, but not compulsion. So we have to move forward. We have a generation that is in despair, and we have to do something about it.
Let's dive a little bit deeper there. So you mentioned the Northwest Ordinance and kind of the vision for public education in America, what it was meant to accomplish. You know, obviously there has been a flowering of classical schools, charter schools, homeschooling, which I think is a positive development, especially in the last 10 years. But I think it's relatively safe to say that the bulk of American students are still probably going to go through some sort of public education. So when we get to an organization or institution, an agency like the NEA, this is something that was founded during the kind of the Great Society era in the 1960s, designed to promote the humanities. Its budget is a couple $100 million, but it really has a massive multiplying effect because it works through matching grants at the state level. So I'm curious with an organization like this. I think if you look back historically, you know, there have been some crazy things that the NEA has funded, but there's been some beneficial things. One thing in particular is Ken Burns's documentary on the Civil War, which I think is, you know, an incredible, moving series, well worth an investment from the government. So I'm curious if you can explain a little bit more deeply how something like the NEA could supplement
NEH.
The NEH, yes. Excuse me. Something like the NEH could supplement, but not sort of subsume the local and mediating institutions, and what your vision might be to pursue projects with these cultural agencies that might actually serve the American people.
Well, I think you would have to make clear on the website and in your general proclamations that we're looking for grant narratives. Ken Burns, by the way, went to high school with me. He was a year older than me. He was quite a character, even back then. But that kind of thing is wonderful. And you know, some people complain about the political leanings of Burns. My view is Americans are divided, and we need to have narratives that are going to be slightly left of center, slightly right of center. We need to develop stories. We need to recreate. We need to develop these stories that that convey to the citizens out there that we have a rich history, an agonizing history, but one which still calls us to redeem this great project called America. I'm not a fan of Nietzsche, but Nietzsche said something very powerful. He saw in the late 19th century that the West was giving up on itself. And he said, what we have to understand is that suffering is not an argument against life. The Ken Burns story is beautiful on the Civil War because he shows the agony of the Civil War, and yet he shows there's something indomitable about the human spirit, the American spirit, which perseveres in spite of that. I think that's the kind of story we need to tell. We cannot have stories of America which completely sugarcoat it. Yes, Jefferson had slaves, but he gave us the Declaration of Independence. Yes, Washington had slaves, but he did not choose to be king. We have to recognize and convey to our fellow citizens that there are no easy answers, that life in America is a constant moral struggle, but that's okay. And so we have to be fully cognizant of the darkness of the human spirit, but we have to tell the tale that that is not the final word. And the problem with the left narrative today, which I think has dominated the NEH for quite some time, is that it tells the story of the darkness of the human spirit, but not the story of a victory of light. And that must change. And government agencies have to be able to convey that. In the next administration, at every level of government, we have to say, yes, there is darkness, but on the other hand, it's time to build anew on hope.
On that note, we'll wrap up. Thanks for joining, Josh.
My pleasure.